Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you again for another Film Fanatic show. It is 9:30 on what day is it? Wednesday. It's easy to lose track because things just move pretty quickly. So hope everyone's doing good. Want to thank some of the new subscribers for joining in on this wacky parade that is Film Fanatic. So yeah, I'm going to be doing a different show today. I'm going to be mixing things up into doing a music show. I've been doing a series. I've done 3 or 4 music oriented videos as of late. I've been doing coverage of my favorite group of all time, although they're not like your traditional band, Alltecker, the English electronic duo. I've been covering some of their albums, talking about my experiences around some of their albums. So I'll continue. I'm going to do more shows on their specific albums because I love all of their work. Their discography is massive, beyond massive, so there's a lot to talk about. For me, it's a, constant, well, source of inspiration that I always go back to. So, and and today, is another show that's going to be music oriented. I'm going to talk about some more stuff as far as groups that I love, or one in particular, and I love to mix things up and to try to add some variety to this channel. And so yeah, so today's show is going to be on also definitely related to my videos on Alltecker. Today is going to be a show on one of my all-time favorite electronic acts, and specifically around their first album, or his first album that I ever heard, and an album that I think is just an utter masterpiece. And it was such a, I don't know, shocking or transcending experience when I first heard this album. But the artist I'm talking about is the one and only Aphex Twin, aka Richard D. James. He highly prolific electronic artist from the UK. His inception pretty much as an artist started in roughly around the same time that Alltecker. Alltecker and Aphex Twin have been on the label for Warp Records. That is, the Warp Records is a British uh, electronic label. Although they have lots of different styles of music, but they're mostly known, or overall, it's probably safe to say most of the work that they've put out and albums are mostly electronica or electronic based stuff. And then also I can't leave out Square Pusher, who is another artist I'm going to be eventually covering. Some of his work for me was such an utter game changer in regards to my perception of what I thought electronic music was. So the album, for me, it's kind of an interesting story, but the album for me that, and I'm a huge Aphex Twin. Aphex Twin is probably, like I said, Warp Records has a massive roster of artists. The artists that have been on the label the longest, like pretty much since its inception. Warp Records basically started out of a record store, and it went from there to where it became a fully realized label in the UK. And the artists from the inception were basically, Square Pusher and Aphex Twin and Alltecker. They basically have been putting out albums, since the 90s. Also beyond. Alltecker actually before. And all three of these artists are just so incredible, especially Alltecker, because I've been doing lots of videos on them. But along the way, and since, Warp Records has really exploded, um, they have had, some very popular, I don't know if you want to call it that, but commercially or well-known artists. Most notably artists like Flying Lotus, who is a really amazing electronic artist, and then also Thundercat. Thundercat was also put out. I believe his first record was put out on Warp Records. I don't believe he's on Warp Records anymore, but so their gamut of music that they have, and that it's also including many other artists too. But I would say, it's safe to say that those artists on Warp Records are the most well known. Autechre, Square Pusher, Aphex Twin, and after that, Aphex Twin is probably the most popular artist on the label. And then you have Square Pusher, of course, a commercially successful artist, but still kind of underground, still not known by the masses to some degree, which is cool. So, so today I'm going to be talking about Aphex Twin's Druks, which is a double album that came out that literally blew my brain, my head off of my body. First, before I get into that, just a quick plug. Today at about 4:30, 4 o'clock. I think it's about. I think actually 4 o'clock today is when it starts. When it starts, I'm gonna be doing. I'm gonna be a guest on a radio show. Peter Patton, who is a local comedian, thespian, really cool guy, really supportive of the arts. He has a radio show on WRFR here in Rockland, Maine, and he does a lot for local music. He comes out to support lots of local live music, and has lots of brings a spotlight onto a lot of local artists here in Mid Coast, Maine, where I live. It's an amazing community. We're a small little kind of rural coastal town, but there is such a concentration of amazing talent, and so Peter does such a great job with showcasing all of these artists. So I'm going to be a guest on his show today at about 4 o'clock on WRFR in Rockland. So if you're around, check it out. I'm going to probably record the show when I'm in the studio so I can put it up here on the channel, seeing, depending how it comes out. And I'm just going to go on as just a regular guest, and I'm going to just talk about, some of my music projects and things, and then, talk about this channel and some movie related things. So check that out. And then if I get a pretty decent recording of that, I'm going to upload it in a few days or so. So stay tuned for that. I'm excited about that. I really love doing interview things. It's probably been about 6 or 7 months since I've done an interview. The last interview I did was last year. I was on someone's show as a guest, and I just did it was basically all about movies and Film Fanatic and Matt Littlefield, who has a really cool podcast, and that was a blast. So stay tuned for that. I'm really excited about doing that. So we'll see how things go and try to get a decent recording and not babble on too long and mumble. So yeah, so this brings me to today's show, which is Aphex Twin's Druks, which is a double album. This was actually Aphex Twin's fifth studio album, and it's hard to believe that this came out It came out in October 2001. It was a double album. I'm a huge fan. I'm sure at some point I'll get into talking more. I'll be doing more shows on Aphex Twin. He's one of my all-time favorite artists as well, and huge influence on me. Definitely when it comes to music, massive influence on me as far as um, inspiration for my band Quantum. So So the interesting, and again, this it all kind of ties back again to someone who I've talked a lot about, and that is my one of my best friends, Sean Russell, who was on this show a couple, 2 3 years ago now, which is crazy. Really great friend. He was a real pivotal person who turned me on to lots of cool music, including All Techer. Got me really invested into checking out a lot of amazing music. When I met him, I was, I always, I feel like even as a kid or in high school, I had a pretty open mind. Like I was pretty much a metalhead. I was pretty much just into metal, but I also listened to like Depeche Mode and I listened to a lot of hip hop, and I had friends that were techno DJs. So I always had kind of an open mind, but I was primarily a rock metalhead guy. Never got exposed to world music, or definitely didn't get exposed at all to like jazz or fusion. And now it's like that's mostly what I listen to. It's really funny. And he was a big, he kind of introduced me to so many different kinds of amazing music that was really above my head, and to a degree still is. I'm always kind of working and trying to study, especially when it comes to jazz. And along with movies, so many great movies and so many great bands and albums. So real key player in shaping, making me into the weirdo that I am. So one of those albums, one of the bands he got me into was the, and again, this was the first album of Aphex Twin that I had ever heard or got exposed to. And since then, I've gotten all of his albums, and I'm a massive fan. I think his discography is pretty consistent. But Druks remains for me easily, hands down, my favorite album of his. It's just a masterpiece. So the interesting thing is, like, again, like I grew up, and it really Drugs really smashed my mindset or conception of what I felt was electronic music. Up until hearing Drugs, I I had this real, I don't know, like a standard view of what I felt electronic music was. And I thought, either my perception of what electronic music was, you know, and it was, maybe a few years after this album, I started to explore other kinds of ambient music and electronic based music, Tangerine Dream, and then especially Brian Eno. So it really opened the floodgates to like changing my perception of what electronic music is. But up until this point, before I heard Drugs for the first time, which is a double album, I pretty much always felt like electronic music is either like techno music, or house music, and that was, I didn't really think of it, the term or the style or the genre of electronic music. I didn't think it was really beyond anything outside of like the standard, four on the floor kind of dance vibe, where it was like straight ahead dance music for the most part. And so because and that was due to, my background, like I my history around dance music, electronic dance music, and electronic music, goes back to since I was a kid. The first band I ever heard was Depeche Mode. That was the first electronic music that I heard. But for the most part, the first album I bought of theirs was Violator. I got that on cassette when I was a really little kid, and I loved that album. But I had a group of friends and stuff that when I was in high school and middle school, this was in the '90s, so like techno and house music was still kind of very much on the underground, but it was starting to become very popular. That's when like the rave scene was really happening, and people were going to giant warehouses to do big parties and to DJ. And I had a little group of friends that were very much kind of plugged into that scene. and they were DJs. And so what they would do, we would hang out and party and whatnot, and do stupid things that kids do that are underage. They would make me all of these like mixtapes of DJ mixes, basically. Now it's called playlists, but these were actually little cassette. I still have them too. These were actually little cassettes that people would make for each other, and these guys would have like a little turntable set up. They'd use records. This was back in the day when people were just using records. They'd have a couple of turntables. They would make these mixes, and then record them and pass them along. So I had a little group of friends that were always mixing music, like in their house. They go to parties, and they make me these mixes, and it was always like kind of harder edged kind of techno, and techno was very popular back then, still is, but like the techno is techno is a little bit stylistically is different than house music, because techno is a little bit more. The tempos are a little bit faster. It's got a little bit more of a hyper aggressive edge to it, whereas house is very much more. I mean, it still has a very aggressive nature. Don't get me wrong, but house has a little bit more of a funky, kind of laid back vibe to it. Really inspired by disco or a lot of soul music. And so, like when you hear good house music, it has. And I love techno. Don't get me wrong, but house music, for me, that's my favorite style as far as dance music. It has a much more soulful kind of influence. From like a lot of the classic '70s records. Disco and it's got a little bit more of a laid back vibe. So there's a different, you know, like techno I feel is like on the beat and house music is a little bit behind the beat. So it's got a little bit more of a laid back kind of cool flavor to it. And that's because I feel of the, kind of the soul and R&B influences that, a lot of those artists and DJs were listening to back then, and disco and those kinds of things. And for years, for all through high school and even up until college, when I thought of electronic music, I thought that's what this is or was. And then my friend Sean, turned me on to Aphex Twin, and I was just my jaw dropped because I had never heard anything so. At that point, up until that point, I never heard anything so dark, so brooding, and insane. It was so. And Druks, like, it's a hard album to really. Well, it's a hard album to really describe. I mean, it's more of an experience. It's such a visceral experience. It's very dark. It's super atmospheric. When I got into this album, at that time, I used to smoke a lot of pot. I used to be a massive pothead in my 20s. And this was like my album, one of my to-go-to albums where I would get blitzed out of my mind and drive around and listen to this album. And I felt like I was, on this, spaceship in space on this like intergalactic journey. I mean, it was just otherworldly, whether I was high or not. And this album was also kind of the exposure to me, for me, around the style, which is another British electronic style, drum and bass or jungle, where it's like you have that really hyperkinetic drum groove and feel, kind of like, I guess a real layman's way of explaining it is taking, like a James Brown groove or drum groove but speeding it up to where it's like really, acid filled. It has this acid filled and it's really hyper and super fast and really intense, but it's kind of derived from that style. That's kind of in a nutshell how I think of jungle or drum and bass. And jungle drum and bass is a little bit more, I don't know, to a degree, a little bit more of a commercial form of that style, whereas jungle happens to be even more extreme and pushing the 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 rhythmic boundaries or the sonic boundaries. And Druks is very much, I feel like, again, it has so many different things going on, even like an industrial vibe. I think it's definitely a jungle album at the end of the day. Like it really, it's super intense, and again, it's got this very haunting. It's an extremely dark album, but it's also, there's all this juxtaposition. It's a gorgeous album. There's all these passages and tunes and pieces within this album where it's so melancholy. It's very sad. It's very dark and very brooding, but then it's also incredibly beautiful and uplifting. And the other thing too about this album, it was all Richard James. Essentially, like, I read a lot about how this album was recorded, and he essentially recorded this whole album. And this is, from 2001, so like technology is, you know, obviously much more advanced now. But this album, and it's a double album, and I feel like this is a concept album because it's very, it's so dystopian. It's the only way I can kind of describe it. This kind of dystopian vision while you're living in this really populated metropolis of a city. That's the only way I can kind of describe it. And this whole album was recorded on a laptop. I've seen interviews, I've read interviews with Aphex Twin Richard James, and he was saying how essentially he would travel on train, and this is how he, with his laptop, and he essentially recorded and did this whole album just him on a laptop. And now, obviously, music, that's a regular way of how people produce music, listen to music, and what have you, and send files to each other, create music, with even with our phones. And this was like, almost 30 years ago. So, such a Richard James Aphex Twin, such a futurist, such a mad scientist, so ahead of his time. And it's an album, it's a concept album that I always go back to and listen to again. It just always blows my mind. And when I first heard it, it just like, it took my entire perception of what I thought, electronic music was, meaning, oh, it's just, four on the floor, or real souped up techno. But basically all kind of four on the floor dance music. And when I heard Druks, it took that whole notion of my kind of ignorant perception, really, of what I felt was electronic music and just smashed it open. And I had this feeling like after getting into this album and discovering it, where I was like, wow, it means the term electronic music, or the electronic music genre, if you will, is so much more broad, and kind of this sense of sky's the limit. It's like, no, it can mean so many things. Like, it just smashed, it like tore the lid off. It tore that band-aid off, and it was like, no, it can mean anything. Like, the sky's the limit. Rhythmically, sonically, it just, for me, it just completely changed my notion on how the potential, or how massive the genre is, and that it is, there, you can't just pinpoint it, or nail it down, or put it in a box and say, well, it's just going to be this, because now it's like it can be anything. And Druks was that album, and it really shattered my brain into millions of pieces, as far as my perception of what I thought electronic music was. So I can't recommend it enough. I'll eventually talk about his other albums. There's so many other great albums in his collection, and but I wanted to talk about this album because I feel like it is such a seminal album, such an important album that it's a it changed my life, and it continues to be a collection of music that I will always revisit, and it continues to always inspire. You know, as much as I love Aphex Twin, and he has, since that album has come out, he put out an EP last summer, which is actually really, really good too. But I will say that ever since Druks, no album has really, even though I love pretty much all of his studio albums, in my honest opinion, I feel like Aphex Twin's stuff has never been as good as that album. In all of his work, and it's again, it's going to be an album that I also high hold in incredibly high regard. He also put out a series of ambient music called Ambient Works Part 2 and Part 1. But Part 2, Ambient Works Part 2, which is a double album of all ambient music that he created, is is probably my favorite ambient music collection. And I'm going to do a show on that also. And so out of all of the work out of Aphex Twin, I would say Druks and then Ambient Works Part 2 are my favorite records, series of records. They're both double albums. They are head and shoulders above. And ever since Druks, I feel like everything has been good and pretty solid. But at the end of the day, just not, not even coming close, really. So thanks again, and we will see you next time. Peace.